this Sunday service for Westside Unitarian Universalist Church here on Zoom. For our Thanksgiving service, we traditionally do the bread communion. And of course, we're all doing it on Zoom from our own locations today. So I just want to let you know, if you want to get something like a little piece of bread and some juice or some wine or whatever your beverage of choice is, you can do that, because we'll be doing that later, a little bit later on in the service. We'll be doing our communion. I've got my little cauliflower wafers here. So, okay, so we'll be doing that in a little while, but I'll just start off by doing the chalice lighting. We light this chalice today in gratitude for all the things that sustain our life, for the warmth of the sun, for the cool oceans, for the vitalizing air, and for all the support that we give each other as beings on this earth. May life on earth continue to thrive. Okay. So the bread communion is an ancient ritual that has its roots in Christian history of our denomination. In it, we formally eat a morsel and drink a morsel. It's charged with symbolic meaning, but of course, because we're Unitarian Universalists, the meaning that we subscribe to it, we each have our own interpretation of the exact symbolism of what it means. So there's no test of creed to participate in the communion at the UU Church. So if you're part of the community today, you're joining in, or even if you're watching on YouTube, you're welcome to join in and take communion with us. So at the Last Supper in the Christian Testament, Jesus breaks bread and is quoted as saying, "Take and eat, because this is my body." And he took a cup saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood." And of course, there's been much debate over the centuries as to the exact meaning and symbology of those words. And of course, splits have occurred in denominations over the interpretation of what it means. But I'm going to share with you a little bit today of what it means to me. So in order to do that, I'm going to take us right back to the beginning of the universe. And physicists tell us that a tiny fraction of the second after our universe came into existence, that everything was just pure energy. There were no particles yet, no matter, nothing. It was just like a wash, a sea of energy. And fractions of a second after the formation of the universe, that energy cooled enough so that it could start to form the fundamental particles that make up our universe, the protons and neutrons, electrons, photons of electromagnetic photons appeared and started bouncing about off everything. But it was still too hot for there to be any atoms. You know, there were just a sea of particles washing about there and electrons in like a plasma. And it took a long, long time, hundreds of thousands of years, for the universe to cool down enough so that those electrons could start recombining with the protons to form atoms of hydrogen, which are the first elements that made up our universe. So, of course, under gravity, all those clouds of hydrogen started to swirl and collapse down to form the first stars. And the first stars, of course, consisted purely of just hydrogen. And as those stars burned and turned their fuel from hydrogen into helium, as they started to die and collapse, they fused that hydrogen and helium into the heavier elements that make up the life, you know, that we know today. The carbon, oxygen, silicon, sulfur, nitrogen, all the things that we know, you know, that make up our Earth today. So it took a whole generation of stars coming together and dying in order to create the elements, fuse those elements that were could go into making our solar system that had actual planets. incredible to think about the fact that a whole generation of stars went into making up the building blocks of our life here today. So, of course, when the second generation of stars started to form and collapse, they had that silicon and oxygen and carbon that was able to, come down into these huge rocky balls that were orbiting those second or third generation of stars, and our Earth formed like that as a hot mass. All that energy of all those rocks coming together and colliding created like a molten ball of lava at that time that was orbiting the sun. Not long after the Earth had formed, there was scientists theorize, and there's pretty strong evidence to support this, there was another planet crashed into the Earth and split off part of its crust as it was just starting to form. And those rocks flew off into orbit to create the moon. I'd love to have been there to see that. They say that in the early days of the Earth, the moon was much closer than it is today. It formed in a ring in orbit, only a few tens of thousands of miles away, not the 250,000 that it is today. So it would have loomed huge in the sky. And as it rotated around the Earth, it raised tides of lava around the Earth a mile high. But the energy that it took to raise those tides, gradually it transferred momentum from the rotation of the Earth. It spanned very, very fast in those days, only 10-hour day in the early days of the Earth. So the moon stole some of the momentum from the Earth, and it started moving away out into a higher orbit than it has today. Otherwise, it would have just like kept the surface of the Earth molten and cracked, and the volcanoes would have been pouring out all the time. So that was the early Earth. With all that cataclysm going on, there was no atmosphere. There was like all this burning lava and the collisions of asteroids and all that kind of stuff. So, of course, the Earth had to cool considerably in order to even form a solid crust, and for the gases coming out of the volcanoes that were full of steam and carbon dioxide to enable those to condense and form the oceans that we've got, that were able to actually start to form the conditions on which life was even possible. So given those first liquid oceans that we had, the scientists who've done experiments about the early conditions of the Earth, they theorized that the first components of life, like self-replicating molecules of protein, probably formed around thermal vents, under the sea. And while I was prepping for this service, I was reading a book by Robert Hazen, who's a geologist who specializes in the relationship between geology and life. And he theorizes that if it wasn't for the minerals around those vents that organic molecules could adhere onto and help to catalyze some of those reactions, then life may not have formed here on the Earth. So we've always been very tied up, even with the rocks and the geology of the Earth. So rocks had a big part to play in the formation of life. And then, of course, as life has taken hold on Earth, life has had a big effect on the geology as well, like laying down all these deposits of limestone over the years, and even making, of course, the oxygen in our atmosphere. Because the first life over hundreds of millions of years, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old approximately. And for hundreds of billions of years in the beginning, there was no life, maybe just these chemicals on the surface of the Earth. And then the first microorganisms were able to form from these self-replicating protein molecules that had been created. And eventually there came to be a kind of microorganism that could capture sunlight and split the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, because there was no oxygen in the atmosphere at that time. So this was the first major cataclysmic climate change, when these organisms started to produce oxygen and the Earth started to rust, because all the iron that was in the Earth's crust at that time, there was nothing to make it corrode, no oxygen to react with it, it would have been like all shiny and new. And now these organisms made this oxygen, and the earth started to rust. And that used up a lot of the oxygen for a long, long time, until the first plants started to evolve, the first real plants, and moved onto land. And at that time, there was another great environmental catastrophe. The plants created all this phosphorus and nitrates that they leached out of the rocks, and it all went into the sea and caused some huge die-offs. And the oxygen levels on the earth rose to as high as 35% when the earth was dominated by plants and there were hardly any animals on there. So, you know, incredible. They say that there were insects with a wingspan like an eagle, because of course, you know, insects have the oxygen has to diffuse into them through these pores in the sides. There's a limit to how big they can grow, but with all that oxygen in the atmosphere, you know, those insects were able to grow to incredible size. So of course we know that the higher animals have only existed for a very short time in the compared to the history of the earth as a whole. And we know that human beings have been here for a very, very short amount of time, a blink of an eye in geological time. So why am I telling you all this? Why go back to the beginning of the universe to talk about, you know, the bread communion? I want to point out that at the beginning of the universe, we were all one substance, one energy. The physicists tell us we were all one energy at the beginning of the universe. And after that, we were all one substance, just this hydrogen that formed out of it. And all of everything, all the great diversity of the elements that formed in the sun came out of that. And then out of that came all this great diversity of life that we have on our planet, the many, many species, and the billions of people, all unique and different, that now inhabit the earth, all came from this same one energy, this same one substance. So when I say, you know, I pick up my piece of food and I say, you know, pick up my wafer and say, this is my body, it really is my body. You know, the human organism has an amazing mechanism for taking what is not part of me and making it part of me. And when I take a drink and I say, this is my blood, I can truly say, this is my blood. These are the substances that make up our bodies, and they accumulate, and we're all part of the earth, and we came out of the earth, and we cannot exist, you know, separate from it right now. So it's a wonderful, miraculous thing. So I could just as easily say, you know, this is my body, this rock here, it's all one substance. But there's a good reason why they go with wine and bread for the communion. They have great symbology historically as well. The bread, because of the leavening of the yeast, that has like this magical transformative property of bulking it up, making it bigger and lightening it, the action of the yeast in there. And of course the wine, because of the way that the yeast works on it and transforms the grape juice into this psychoactive substance that can even change our consciousness and the way that we feel, and, you know, make us feel a part of everything that is around us. I mean, they have a great symbology historically. So we do tend to stick with the grape juice and the bread for our communion, but anything will do. And anytime you are partaking of food, anytime in your life, you can say to yourself, wow, what a miracle that I can take in this food, what's not part of me, and it becomes a part of myself. So I'm going to, so yeah, as we prepare to partake of our sacred communion, I want you to remember that our body has this miraculous property of turning what's not itself into itself. So let us take our wafer and take our drink, and we will take our communion. Speaking of Rumi, a chickpea leaps almost over the rim of the pot where it's been boiled. Why are you doing this to me? The cook knocks him down with a ladle. Don't you try to jump out. You think I'm torturing you, but I'm giving you flavor so you can mix with spices and rice and be the lovely vitality of a human being. Remember when you drank rain in the garden? That was for this. Grace first, sexual pleasure, then a boiling new life begins, and the friend has something good to eat. Eventually, the chickpea will say to the cook, boil me some more. Hit me with the skimming spoon. I can't do this by myself. I am like an elephant that dreams of gardens back in Hindustan and doesn't pay attention to his driver. You're my cook, my driver, my way into existence. I love your cooking. The cook says, I was once like you, fresh from the ground. Then I boiled in time and boiled in the body, 2 fierce boilings. My animal soul grew powerful and I controlled it with practices and boiled some more and boiled once beyond that and became your teacher. I'd like to finish up today with one more reading to extinguish our chalice. It's from the Tao by Lao Tzu. One of my favorite readings in the hymnal. Before creation, a presence existed, self-contained, complete, formless, voiceless, mateless, changeless, which yet pervaded itself with unending motherhood. There can be no name for it, I have called it the way of life. Perhaps I should have called it the fullness of life, since fullness implies widening into space, implies still further widening, implies widening until the circle is whole. In this sense, the way of life is fulfilled. Heaven is fulfilled. Earth is fulfilled. And a conscious being is also fulfilled. There are 4 amplitudes of the universe, and a conscious being is one of them. People rounding the way of earth, earth rounding the way of heaven, heaven rounding the way of life, until the circle is full. Go in peace until we meet again.